The Rottweiler had always been gentle with the baby. That was the part Isaiah kept coming back to. In the 2 weeks since they'd brought Cora home from the hospital, Bruno had not once behaved in a way that alarmed him. The 112-pound Rottweiler had met the baby at the door with the careful sniff and assess that Isaiah had rehearsed with him using the hospital blanket the week before. He had established a floor position beside the bassinet. He had tolerated the 3 a.m. disruptions and the crying and the particular chaos of a house reorganizing itself around a newborn, with the equanimity of an animal that had decided his job was to be present and calm regardless of what was happening around him. He was not calm on the 3rd morning, he was not aggressive, he was not growling. He was positioned, specifically and deliberately positioned between Isaiah and the bassinet, and when Isaiah reached past him to lift Cora for the morning feed. Bruno moved into the space between Isaiah's arm and the bassinet, and stood there. Isaiah was a high school football coach. He had spent 15 years managing large physical situations with bodies that were bigger than he could always control. He knew the difference between a dog that was threatening and a dog that was doing something else entirely. Bruno was doing something else. He stepped back. Bruno stayed. He tried again, coming from the left side. Bruno angled his body left. If you stay for stories about what animals sense before we do, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On the 2nd morning, he called his wife Natasha in from the kitchen. She was a nurse practitioner who had been on maternity leave for 2 weeks, but whose professional assessment mode did not take leave. She watched Bruno for about 90 seconds. She said, "He's not being aggressive. He's staying between you and the baby." Isaiah said he knew. He said, "What does that mean?" Natasha said she wasn't sure. She noted that Bruno had done this since the previous morning and asked whether Isaiah had noticed any change in Cora. Isaiah said she'd been sleeping more. Natasha said babies slept a lot. They brought Cora to the morning feed. Bruno allowed Natasha to lift her and did not reposition. On the 3rd morning, Bruno blocked Isaiah again, and this time also positioned himself between the bassinet and the door. The specific configuration of a dog that had decided the baby's perimeter required coverage. Natasha came in and lifted Cora. Cora's colour, she noted, was not quite right. Not dramatically, not the grey of active distress, but a slight pallor around the mouth that had not been there the day before. She felt her fontanelle. It was slightly bulging. She called 911. Has your dog ever done something you couldn't explain until it was the only thing that made sense? Tell us in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard. The paramedic was a woman named Diane, who had been in pediatric emergency response for 12 years. She did her assessment in the living room while Isaiah held Bruno by the collar. Not because Bruno was a threat, but because he was large and occupied space that Diane needed. He sat beside Isaiah and watched Diane work. Cora had a fever. Not registered on the forehead thermometer they'd been using, a surface reader. Less accurate on an infant's forehead than the rectal thermometer they hadn't used. The rectal reading was 38.9. The fontanelle, Diane confirmed, was slightly elevated. She called for transport. At the hospital, the pediatrician on call was Dr. Amara Osei. She ordered the workup. The results came back in 45 minutes. Urinary tract infection, likely ascending from the birth process. In a 2-week-old, a UTI was a sepsis risk. In a 2-week-old with a slightly bulging fontanelle, the sepsis workup was urgent. The lumbar puncture was clear, no meningitis, but the blood cultures showed early bacterial growth. The antibiotic course began within the hour. Dr. Osei came to speak with them after the admission was complete. She reviewed the timeline. She asked when the dog had first started blocking. Isaiah said 3 mornings, maybe 4. He might have noticed something on the 2nd morning and told himself it was nothing. She looked at her notes. The The fever was likely building for 48 to 72 hours before the fontanelle became symptomatic. She looked at him. That dog knew before the fontanelle changed. Isaiah asked how. She said the same things animals always knew before humans. Chemical change. Body temperature differential. The specific metabolic signature of an immune system mounting a response. Dogs detected these things at concentrations well below human sensory threshold. Whether Bruno was detecting the infection, the fever, or the behavioral change in a baby whose body was working harder than it should be, she couldn't say. What she could say was that the timeline was consistent. Every guardian deserves to be recognized, even the ones who never asked for anything in return. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. They brought Cora home 10 days later. The infection resolved, cultures clear. Bruno was at the door. He moved aside to let Natasha carry the carrier through. He followed her to the bassinet. He took his position on the floor beside it. He was there in the morning. He was there in the afternoon. He was there at midnight, when the house was quiet, and Cora was sleeping, and the only sound in the room was the white noise machine and the slow, even breathing of a 112-pound Rottweiler, who had been assigned this post before anyone thought to give it to him. Isaiah sat on the floor beside him one night, late, and put his hand on the dog's back. Bruno exhaled, slow, deep, and didn't lift his head. The next story is about a dog who detected something in a house's walls that no machine had found yet. The family had been living in it for 3 weeks. Subscribe so you're there when it posts.